right. Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us for KeyShot World Virtual Edition 2021. I'm your host. I'm Derek Cicero. I'm the Vice President of Products here at Luxion, the makers of KeyShot. As many of you are aware, last year we had an in-person event scheduled for Huntington Beach that we had to cancel for COVID-19. And one of the things that we did was we brought all those great presenters online, and we got amazing feedback from our customers about how much they loved having this kind of virtual event where instead of having to travel, we came to you. And so we liked it so much, we're doing it again. So this is KeyShot World 2021 Virtual Edition again. We got some really great presenters for you this year to enjoy. It's gonna be 3 days today, Tuesday, Wednesday, and Thursday, 3 sessions per day, which I'll walk through. And hopefully we can see all each other again in person in 2022. In case you missed it last year, we had some amazing stories from folks at PepsiCo, Spin Master, all kinds of great content. If you missed it, it's on our YouTube channel. There's a KeyShot World 2020 playlist that you can go back through and visit all the great content that we had. As always, all of these sessions will be recorded as well for our YouTube channel. So if you miss a session that's happening at a scheduled time, you can always come back and get it later. And I also would highly recommend that you join our YouTube channel. If you haven't already, we are putting out, amazing quick tips and tutorials and all kinds of great learning content from our team every week out there. We actually passed 60,000 subscribers. So thank you if you subscribe, appreciate it. But it really is just a great place if you really want to kind of unpack your KeyShot knowledge. And so for the next 3 days, what we're going to be doing is we have 3 sessions a day. There'll be a 10 a.m. session, a noon session, and a 2 p.m. session, all Pacific time. At the end of the 2 p.m. session, we'll be doing a giveaway. So we have 3 giveaways this week. We have a GoPro camera today. Tomorrow, we'll be giving out a KeyShot Pro. And Thursday, we're giving out an A6000 graphics card from the wonderful folks at NVIDIA. But I did want to give a quick plug to the wonderful folks at GoPro. Avid KeyShot users, you can just feel the KeyShot magic off this package. So this is going out today. If you attend any of the sessions, we'll pull folks, we'll pull someone from random from all 3 sessions, and you'll get this. But tune in at 2 o'clock to see who wins it. So thank you again to the folks at GoPro. So as I mentioned, there's 3 sessions today. The first one is going to be Shane Spence from Shane Spence Design. He's going to talk about how he uses KeyShot in his role as a product visualizer, and more specifically, some of the things that he's uncovered, his learnings, both easy and difficult, that have made him a KeyShot power user today. So that's going to be fantastic. After that, at 2 p.m., Brooke Harrington, one of the creative specialists here at Luxion, is going to be walking through KeyShot Sketch to Shelf. This is a very exciting program. We have a thing called Envoy that we've put together that she's going to walk you through. And it really explains all the ways you use KeyShot from ideation out to AR and VR and getting things out on the web. And it's really great because we built the whole web page around it. So not only can you watch the presentation, but there'll be really great assets for you to download, 3MF, GLB, configurator files. So that's going to be a great presentation. And then at 2 p.m., we have our good friend, Mike James. He's very well known in the KeyShot community. And Mike James works at Thomas Burke, and he's going to be talking about how he uses the KeyShot configurator with Specialized, the bike manufacturer, to make design decisions more effectively and efficiently. So if you're a fan of Mike James, the configurator, or just bikes, I definitely recommend that one. It's going to be a great one. Since we can't get together in person, I would encourage everyone to join us on our social media channels, LinkedIn, Twitter, and Instagram. You can use the hashtag KeyShot World. If you get inspired by some of the cool things you're seeing this week, we absolutely recommend that, do some renderings, do some cool stuff, right? Share all the exciting things that you're learning and post it out there, and we'll share it with the hashtag KeyShot World. You can also subscribe to our newsletter if you haven't already. We have a monthly newsletter that goes out that kind of talks about all the great things going on in KeyShot land. And we'll also be summarizing the presentations that we do each day and telling you what's coming next. So I recommend that. Finally, there will be a Q&A session at the last 15 minutes of each presenter. So if you have questions, throughout the process, we'll have staff on hand to answer questions about pricing or features. But if you want to engage with the presenters, I will be moderating a 15-minute Q&A at the end of each session to do so. So with that, I want to sincerely thank everyone for joining us from wherever you are. Please give us a shout out in the chat from if you're from far away. You'll always love to see people dialing in from far away locales. But with no further ado, I will give it to Shane Spence from Shane Spence Design. Shane, take it away.
Thank you very much, Derek. I'm just going to share my screen now. Is that coming through for everyone?
Looks wonderful.
Good stuff. Well, as I said, thank you for having me, and thanks for having me here at KeyShot World. It's great to be able to connect with everyone. As you can probably tell from my accent, I'm from England, so I really wouldn't usually be attending this sort of event. And yeah, I'm really excited to get this great event kicked off. So as mentioned, yep, my name is Shane Spence. I'm a freelance product visualizer based in West Sussex in England on the South Coast. And today I'm just going to have a little chat with you about how I use KeyShot in my workflow as a product visualizer and how I've improved my skills in KeyShot over time. A bit of background about me first. I studied industrial design at university, and that's really where I fell in love with KeyShot. That's where I got my first taste of proper rendering, because my favorite part of the process was always the visual side of things and getting my designs into rendering software as soon as possible to really make them come to life. So much so that it quickly became a hobby of mine, and I started doing it in my free time using the KeyShot trial first and then the student edition. And now it's what I do exclusively, just the visual side of things. So when people ask me what I do and I say product visualizer, sorry, usually there's a bit of confusion there. So the way I describe what a product visualizer is I'm essentially a product photographer, but in a digital world. I don't have a real camera. I don't use real lights. And most of the time, I'm not even using real products. So a client will approach me because they need some help creating some interesting visuals. This could be to help launch a product or sell a concept if they're doing like a Kickstarter or something like that. And they can, really use the power of rendering. And the good thing about rendering, the fact that you aren't limited by reality. You can, make it as abstract as you want. And as I said, the product doesn't even need to exist. You could have a full marketing campaign done before the product's even being produced. So that's a real advantage of it. So in terms of what I'm going to talk about today, the title of this session is the power of practice and getting things wrong, as this is what I would attribute most of my growth in KeyShot to. And then I'm going to take you through a scene which I created for this session. And we'll talk a bit about studios. We'll go through some of the materials I've created and the lighting setup. So firstly, how did I get here? Well, I suppose we start from the beginning with some of my early renders. I've been using KeyShot properly now for about 4 years. We touched on 3ds Max at university, but never got into the nitty gritty material graphs and creating our own materials, things like that. And that was probably my favorite part. I quickly learned was trying to make these textures from scratch and getting them as close to realism as I can. So as I said, I started doing this in my free time and started posting some of my renders online. So I think that is kind of the first part of the session title there is, the power of practice and almost the power of playing. I started it as a hobby, even though it was part of my degree and it definitely helped. I think having that foundation of genuinely enjoying what I was doing, I was able to spend hours in the software and have it not feel like work. And I feel like that is a big driver for my improvement is, having that desire to want to learn new things and going out and finding solutions. And then the next part is, not being afraid to get things wrong. So when you go in from a hobby point of view, you can get a lot more creative with it. And, if you take too long trying to get that certain effect you're going for, it's only for you. So it doesn't matter. You can really just try to express yourself and you'll slowly but surely see a bit of progression. Which then kind of brings me on to getting things wrong. And what I would say is to embrace that. The funny thing is I actually wasn't planning on talking about this for this session. I had a completely different session in mind. However, I just couldn't get the render that I was trying to do, I just couldn't get it looking right. I must have spent 3 hours on this scene 3 or 4 different times, and yeah, as I said, I just couldn't get it to click. So I had to completely flip the script to get something I was happy with. And as I said, I would embrace that because sometimes that's what you need. And when you're doing these kind of exercises by yourself where you can have that flexibility, then I would definitely encourage you to embrace that and just completely change it up to see if you can get your creative juices flowing again. Um, and the good thing about that is, even though you are starting again, you're not wasting all that time, because you can learn these new techniques and you're getting faster in the software as you're trying things. So these examples on the screen here, you can kind of see the images on the left showing the first time I tried a certain technique, and really wasn't happy with it, and you could have seen it as a wasted time. But the images next to them is a time when I've reused that technique, and I was really happy with the results. And they wouldn't have been possible if I hadn't been playing around in the software, trying out all these techniques, and getting it wrong is how it felt at the time. But little did I know it would come in handy down the road. So that brings me to where I am now, with some of my recent work on the screen here. So how I got here, I would say I owe most of what I know about KeyShot to the internet, essentially. I've learned most things through trial and error and YouTube, and hang out on the KeyShot forums and looking at people's material graphs, essentially. But another great way to practice and get better is through things like Instagram challenges. So things like Render Weekly. These are a great source because they supply you with ready-made briefs, which you've usually got a week to 2 weeks to spend on. But it's a low-pressure environment. There's lots of variety, so you can hone your skills in a bunch of different areas, from furniture to electronic appliances. So you really get to practice a whole spectrum of styles. And another good thing is it introduces you to the online rendering community, especially in KeyShot. There's a growing community, which I'm a part of, and there's more and more people who are sharing learning content every day. So I think getting involved in that is great, because everyone is really friendly and is always happy to help wherever they can. But another thing which I have done to really improve my skills, which is actually what I'm going to take you through this session, is sort of making up your own clients. So how this process usually goes for me is I start with an image or a real product that I've seen, and I go, wow, I really like that material. I want to learn how to do it. And I think that's just the type of person I am. If I see something, I kind of see it as a bit of a challenge, and it almost annoys me, the fact that I can't think of how I would make this. So I would find that real product or the image and essentially work backwards. So I would apply a quick target audience to it. Um, Again, I wouldn't overthink this part of it. Having the brief, it does help to give you a bit of structure, but um, you can take it as far as you want, really. If you're just doing a quick exercise in KeyShot, then you just want a quick target audience. You don't even need to name the product, and from that you can build your mind maps for your visuals. But in this case, I've given it a little name and made a quick logo. But you can take it as far as you want with these exercises. You can do the branding, you can do the packaging, you can go off and do your own research if you want, because this could also be, a great way to build into your portfolio if you've got some gaps that you want to fill for a specific style. So what I've done here is I've given it the name of Candy Flops, because I looked at those slippers and first things I thought was candy floss, and flip flops, which I suppose doesn't quite translate over to America, because I think you guys call it cotton candy. But anyway, that was my thought process. So I've given it that target audience, as you can see there. And the reason I've done that is so that I can pull out some related words. And using these related words, you can build those into a mind map, everyone's favorite exercise when they're trying to come up with ideas. And this will enable you to pick as many little details to try and implement into your renders. And this will help you to tell a story or convey a certain emotion, a certain message, through semiotics. Because at the end of the day, a lot of the visuals that I produce are for marketing purposes. So they're targeted at a particular type of person, and maybe wants them to feel a certain way about whatever product it is that that's on show. So once you've got these related words, I would then encourage you to jump into a mood board. So get out there and using sort of your strongest words that you want to build off. Jump onto Pinterest or something like that, and try and collect some inspiration. I would recommend to not just stay in one lane. So even though I was going to be rendering footwear, I had a look at some footwear photography just to get an idea of what they were doing. But go and look at different industries and see what they're doing, and see if there's anything that you can adopt. Because doing this will really help to inform your render when you get into the software, so that you're not wasting time and you do have a bit of direction. It just helps so much with with your inspiration and decision making process. So then before I jump into KeyShot, what I like to do is some thumbnail sketches. So this is kind of basic building blocks of what I want my render to look like. But the key here is not to be too strict on yourself, especially as this is a personal project. You can be as creative as you want, but I do like to almost put myself in a bit of a box so that I can force myself to think outside the box. Not sure if that really makes sense, but I feel like it works for me. But yeah, don't be too strict, because personally, I find a lot of my ideas come to me whilst I'm working. So once I've got my basic materials and basic lighting set up, that's when I start to see things a bit clearer, and I may have a brand new idea which I hadn't even thought of when I was, on the pencil and paper. Because like with anything, happy accidents can occur, and as you can probably see here, I think about 6 images in, I was just rotating my camera around, having a look, and stopped on the view. I think the 7th image in there, and that was actually the one that I carried through to the end and used in my final render. So it's just about getting as many iterations done as you can, which is a good thing about KeyShot with your with the real-time render. It really allows you to have that instant feedback to make decisions quickly. So that's great. And you just got to remember, whilst you're working, a lot of rendering is about trial and error. Getting things wrong and having to work out a solution around it will make it stick in your brain so much more than going on YouTube and just finding the answer straight away. And the other good thing about rendering is there's often loads of ways to do the same thing, so not one way is right. So that brings us to the final renders here. So I created 3 in total, one being more product focused with a zoomed in view in the middle, and then one being a little bit more stylized, a bit more abstract. And I feel like we were able to use things here from the previous iterations that we didn't carry through for the first view, but we used them in the second, the third render there. So again, that goes back to this whole getting things wrong, and not everything is a waste of time, even though it may feel like it. Because if I take a step back there, you can see the lollipops on the floor and the trial of reflecting the sky using this mirror. They were used in this second render, and because I'd already tried those setups, it was much quicker the second time round having to redo it, and I felt like it worked much better. And you may also notice some of the stuff we carried over from our mood board. Again, because we're not designing a new product, and this isn't for an actual client, it's okay to use this as inspiration and trying to try these techniques quite closely. So what things that I've adopted here is using the harsh shadows with the sort of foliage in the background, the composition using a step with the shoes kind of pressed up against it, and again trying the reflecting the sky effect there, because that's not something I'd actually seen a whole lot of or tried myself. So yeah, I learned things making these renders myself. So that's the renders. Now I'm going to jump into KeyShot and we'll take a little look around the scene. So if I just unpause here and go into my free camera. We can have a little look around. So in terms of the general setup here, it's quite simple. I've got, if I just disable some of these, I've got a basic plane being used as the ground plane. I've got one spotlight, which is driving the majority of the lighting for the scene. I've then got 3 cubes, which I've stacked to make this kind of step object. And these have just been taken from the KeyShot library in the models geometry. The reason I've done it this way is, again, just to give me that extra flexibility where I could try multiple different looks, just by toggling some of these on and off. If I decided on one that I fully liked, I would maybe go back into CAD and actually model them and, sort out the fillets and the interaction with the ground. But because this is just a quick sort of visual exercise, using the tools within KeyShot is going to be a lot faster for you because it gives you that extra flexibility. The rest of the setup, I've then got these 2 spheres here, which again have been taken from the model library here, 2 discs, which again are from the model library, and then these 2 lollipops, which I actually downloaded from the cloud library, which you can find down here. There's lots of great models on there, which make additions to your scenes so much quicker. So the next thing, as I mentioned with the lights, we've got the spotlight here, which is driving most of the lighting, but we have also made our own environment. So just by going into create blank environment, all I've done, it's quite simple, is just a gradient here. And the gradient is just a very dark blue, just to give some blue in our shadows. And then I've got one light here, which is just providing a bit of fill light from the opposite direction. And in terms of color, I've given it a bit of a cooler color on the Kelvin spectrum. So if you don't know where to find this, it's just in your drop downs for your color and Kelvin. And the reason I've done that is because I've actually used a warmer color for my main light. So it just provides a nice bit of contrast. Other things in the setup, I am working in photographic mode. I usually work in photographic mode. You can see the difference between basic there. I just feel like photographic mode gives you a lot more control over the final look of the image. I usually do start in low contrast. I've tipped the white balance a bit to the warmer side. I've then utilized the curve here to do a bit of tone mapping. I've increased the vibrance a little bit for the colors. And then in denoise, I've actually got that quite high. That isn't how I did in the final image. I've just got it high for this presentation to try and clear the picture up a little bit for you. But my sort of general rule of thumb is I do try and get the renders looking as good as possible in KeyShot before I go over to Photoshop and things like that for post. Because this photographic tab, since that's been introduced, I use that on all of my renders, I would say now. So that's it for my basic setup there. So the next thing I wanted to talk about was studios and how you can use them to render efficiently. So if you've never used studios before, you probably won't see this tab here. So if you go into your window tab and click there for studios, or press U on your keyboard, and I like to add it into my library tab, and just so I can click between the two. So the way studios work, they work hand in hand with model sets. And again, if you've not seen these before, chances are you've never touched these. So you just click these 3 dots here and drag them to the side. And then what model sets allow you to do is split up your different models into almost like layers. So as you can see here, if I disable some, I've got a background layer, I've then got one product, I've then got another. So using these two together, you can use studios to enable and disable the visibility of different model sets. And so the good thing about this is you can set up in your render settings your studios. So they would render in a batch in the same way that you would with your cameras, but you have that added functionality of enabling and disabling the different models. So what you can also do is control the camera. You can change between different environments, but we just have one. If I was to make a new one, You can see now that we've got 2 options there, but we've only used 1 in this case. So I'll disable that. Same with your image styles, where if you were to make a new image style and say you wanted one which was a lot cooler, and I know that's very extreme, but just to show you there, you've got both options. But as we've only got 1, I'll leave that disabled. Your model sets, as mentioned earlier, you can enable and disable these depending on the shot that you're going for. And then the last thing is multi-materials. So you may notice when we click through our different studios here that whilst the environment and lighting is all the same, the color of the steps and the floor is actually swapping around with each other. And that's using multi-materials, which I'll show you how to set up in a minute. So if we take a look at how to create one of these, if I just jump into left slider, so this is a camera that I've made, and it's not being used by any of the studios yet. So if we want to create a new studio, you just go up here, add studios, and that will set one off this current view. As mentioned earlier, we've only got 1 environment, so we don't need that enabled. We've got the right camera selected. Image styles, we don't need that enabled because we only have 1. Model sets, going to enable that. But in this instance, I'm going to turn off the lollipops and all those other bits. So it's just focused on the product. And then just to show you how it works, if I enable multi-materials and I go for my steps and I change those to the other color, then with a bit of luck, when we click to here, it changes back to the old color, but back to here. And there we go. So that's how that works. In an ideal world, for this particular shot, let's say I just wanted to look at the left one, I can hide the right slider there, and that won't show up on this view. But that does mean whenever I click onto my other slider view, it's still going to be disabled because it doesn't overwrite this visibility here. So what I would do is I would go into add model set and I would separate that slider into a left slider model set and a right slider model set. And then that way I would get that full functionality where I could render all 4 of these images overnight or something like that. And, everything would be set up correctly. So if we now take a look at the light, so how I got this effect with the trees in the background, if you've never seen this before. So if I pull up the material graph, it's just a spotlight material. So if I jump up here just so we can see it. So the way I've added that in there, if you don't know, is to add geometry, and you can add a plane and then change the material to a spotlight, which would be here, or you can just go to add light and add a spotlight and position it. I like to have my geometry view open here, which again, you can go and press O or click in here to open that. And that will help you navigate your scene a little bit easier, especially if you're going to be locked into one camera, so you can move that light around. Sorry. So if we just pull that up again, and if I just disconnect this texture, then we can understand the spotlight a bit better. So the spotlight casts this spotlight shape on here. Your beam angle controls the size. The fall off will control the feather around the side of this circle. So if we brought that down to 0, you get a sharp fall off there. If we bring it all the way up to 1, then it's completely feathered. So we just bring that down to 0.5. And the radius controls the size of your light. So the smaller it is, the harsher and more crisp these shadows are going to be. So 5 is quite small, so we've got nice crisp shadows because I was trying to go for a sunlight kind of look. But if I bumped that up to 250, you can see these shadows soften out a lot more. So we bring that down. So how I've brought this effect in, if I zoom in here, you might be able to see it a bit better, is using this texture which I made in Photoshop. And it's quite simple. The way this works when I connect it is anything that's black, it's controlling the color of the light. So anything that's black will show no light. Anything that's white will cast a white light, and then your gray values in between that will have a bit of opacity to them. But to give it this color, I have, if I double click in here, you can see blend with color, or if you click on your spotlight, drop down your color, blend with color. I've done the same as I showed you earlier with the Kelvin, but I've gone on the warmer side, and that's how you would blend it with the color. So you can change that to whatever you want, and you can get some really interesting looks for what you want. But as I was going for a more natural looking thing, that's why I've gone for something on the Kelvin scale. So you can get really creative with this. You can go for foliage. You could remove that foliage and just have the hard lines, which would create a nice, interesting composition to frame your product. But you can get more creative with even the KeyShot textures in here. If you just right click textures, you could pull up the mesh or something like that. If you connect that, you can see we're going to have quite a wacky effect there. But if you change that to line, then you could get this cool sort of look here, which could be like blinds or something like that. So you can get really creative with it. That's how that's made. It's quite a popular style at the moment in photography and things like that. So there are other ways of achieving it. As I said earlier, there's usually a lot of ways of doing things where you could import a real model of a tree, and in your just use a really small light behind it. You could do the same thing using a custom environment and just make a really small pin, which would work almost as a sun, and that would cast that shadow. But I just like using it this way because I feel like there's a bit more flexibility. So if we now take a look at some of these materials that I've got going on. So if we start with the ground material, this is the multi-material I was talking about earlier. So how I would go around creating this, if I just get rid of this just so we can see and actually look at one. So your usual material will look like this, and this is how it's set up. I've just got sort of a desaturated purpley color there, with a little bit of roughness. And as you can see over here, I've got a noise fractal in the bump. If I double click that and press C on my keyboard, then you'll be able to view the mapping information. And all that's doing is as you can see, bump height of 0.05. It's just introducing a little bit of variation to that surface there, just so it's not completely perfect, but you don't want to go overboard. Subtlety is important with that there. So creating the multi-material, you would click the multi-material box, and as I know that I want it to be the same material, just a different color, you can click on this duplicate material and link textures so that it keeps our bump map the same. And then we can just double click in this one and just change the color over. I think it was something like that. And there you go. So you can click through these two, and as shown earlier in your studios, in your studios, the ground, we've now got both of those in there as well. And you can get really creative with this. You can duplicate it again and change your color again to something completely different, and that will still be reflected in your studios down here, where you can jump between all three. So that's the ground. The next thing we can have a look at is the foam. So this was quite simple, where we've just got another standard plastic material, but in the bump, you might be able to see this kind of pattern here, which makes it look a bit more like foam, almost like polystyrene. If I double click on that and press C, that is just using the leather texture. If I right click, go into textures and go into leather from KeyShot. So that's a procedural texture. So you can scale that as big as you want. You don't need to UV map or anything. And I've just plugged that into the bump. I've changed the color to black and white because that works best with bumps. And that's it for the basic material, really. I've then also got a displacement map which I made for the logo to indent into the foam here. So if I just disconnect that and execute that geometry, we can see the texture here. So it's just a black and white texture, and how these work is black will result in no displacement, whereas white will displace it by 100% of whatever your displacement height is. So as you can see here in Photoshop, when I've made the white text, I've then also added an inner glow to it, but changed that glow to black, so that it fades to white. So there is some gray going through there, so that it's not such a harsh transition from absolute black to absolute white. because that would result in an unrealistic looking displacement. And it's, it's always better, and if you can smooth it a bit, to add a little bit of roundness, because everything in reality would have, some sort of fillet to it. So that is the foam material there. Then if we just take a look at the fuzz. So the main thing of this fuzz here that I wanted to achieve was this rainbow color scheme here. So if I just disconnect the fuzz quickly, I'll show you how I made this. So I started with a noise fractal. If I view the map there, you can see the reason I've gone for this is because there's lots of levels or from black to white, with all these different veins running through it. And I knew just by using Photoshop and using a gradient map in Photoshop, you can map different colors to different values of white, gray, and black. So if you go into your textures and add a color gradient, you can then connect this noise fractal to the color gradient, and that works how I just described there, where these colors are mapped to the different values along that, from white to black. So if I change this color to something a little bit more noticeable, you can see that when I start to move this around, it starts to affect the different levels of gray. And again, you can play around with your scale and everything like that, and you can get some really interesting looks. But I was quite happy with what I got. So that is just plugged into a velvet material. I like to use velvet when I'm using fuzz, because I think it gives it a little bit of a softer look. So nothing too crazy going on here. I've got the sheen set to be relatively dark, because most of it's going to be covered by fuzz anyway. Roughness of 0.1. The backscatter, I've got a 1.2. That just controls the amount of scattered light. So if you put that up to something like 2, you can see there's a lot more scattering going on than when there's 0. And then your edginess is essentially the brightness of the glow around your edges that you would see with velvet. So if we bump that up to 10, you can start to see more of that coming in the edges to 0. Then there's, nothing. So I've got that quite low, because I don't actually want a velvet looking material. It's more just as a base. And then I've got a noise texture, which I've just plugged into the bump, again, just to introduce a little bit of variation. So for my actual fuzz, what I've done is I've duplicated the velvet material. And the reason I do this is so that I can control these parameters independently. So the sheen has been made a little bit brighter. The backscatter has been reduced a little bit, but the edginess has also been reduced, because then we get those kind of glowing edges on our fuzz, which I think is what helps to make it look a bit softer. So if I connect that there and execute, and whilst that reses up so we can see it a bit clearer, I'll just talk you through some of these parameters. So your main ones to get that kind of realistic looking fuzz, I would say, is your length variation and randomness. So length variation does pretty much what it says on the tin. So it varies the length of each strand. So the higher you put that, the more variation you'll have. And then with randomness, that introduces a little bit of curling and things like that, so that your hairs look a little bit more random. But I haven't gone too high on this, because I knew I wanted to control some of the direction using a texture, which I'll touch on in a minute. Your radius is just the thickness of each fiber, and then the density is just how dense it is. Your segments is how many segments each bit of fuzz is broken into. So if you have got your randomness set quite high, you'd want the segments to be quite high too, so that they can curve around smoothly, instead of being jagged. And then I've changed the shape to cylinder. So you can kind of see the results we've got here now. So I'm going to talk you through what I've got going on here with the other textures. So if I disconnect all of these and execute the geometry node, you'll see what that looks like. So whilst I don't think this is a bad look at all, I just think it looks a bit too uniform, a bit too perfect. I just reduce my denoise, you might see that a bit clearer. yeah, so it's all kind of jutting out the same direction. It's all very even. So what I've done is I've introduced this triplanar texture to control the density and the length. So if I disconnect this here, and I'll just quickly show you what a triplanar is. So if you right click, go into your textures and go into triplanar, what this does is it allows you to map an image texture in all three directions. So I've actually just taken this, it's a leather image texture from the KeyShot library. So if you just type in leather, I think it's this one here. And the reason I've done this instead of the procedural one I mentioned earlier is I just prefer kind of the fall off and the creases that you've got going on here. It looks a little bit more varied, doesn't look as perfect. But the good thing about the triplanar, sorry, what you would actually do with that is you would click and drag this into here, and then that would apply the mapping. So, sorry, just that. Yeah. So what this does is it applies the texture in each direction. And if you take this blend seams down to 0, you can see the seam lines here. So if you've not got a model which has been UV unwrapped and you're not using an infinite texture, repeatable texture, using something like a triplanar is a good way to get around that, because you can blend the seams so it smooths that transition a bit more. It is, quick and dirty, but if the texture that you're trying to control isn't like the main part of the object, then you don't need to worry too much. So if you're doing things like if it's going to be a roughness map or something like that, then you'd rather use a triplanar so that you don't get those clear seams. Whereas if you were using it as sort of the diffuse, the color, you would probably want to use either a procedural texture or an image texture that is repeatable. So what I've done is I've connected this to the density and the length. And if we execute that, you can see the effect that that's had. These textures work in a very similar way to the displacement that I spoke about earlier. So all the black values will result in 0% of your density and or length, and then white will result in the maximum of what you've put in these boxes. So by doing this to control the density and length, kind of clumps the hairs together, which I think gives quite a nice effect here to make it look again a bit more natural. That they're all they're not all coming out in the same direction in the same parts. They're kind of clumping together. So then the last thing I've got here, controlling the fuzz, is a cellular texture. So again, completely procedural. Just right click textures and cellular in there. And all I've done to this is increase the noise, played around with the shape and contrast and the levels there. And what this will do, the black and white textures, they will affect the direction that the fibers go in. So just having that sharp difference between white and gray and black will introduce quite a nice bit of variance. So if I just turn on my region render, you can see up here that you've got these fibers running this way, whereas these ones are going here, and it just gives it that little bit more of a worn look that I think this sort of material works well with. So what I'll do now is I'll jump across to the slippers, just to quickly show you another thing that I did with the fuzz, how you can combine two textures for a different effect. So you may notice here, it's pretty much the exact same material being used on the slipper, but we've got this label here, and this isn't actually modeled or anything. That's just done all within KeyShot. So again, if I just disconnect that fuzz so we can see things a bit clearer, I have got this plastic texture separate and I've added it as a label. So how you do that, you right click materials, grab a plastic, and then attach that as a label. And if I take away my maps here, you can see what that will do is apply a brand new plastic texture over everything. And what you can do is use different textures and things like that to map out this material so that it only is in one place. So if I drag this here, which is my opacity map, which I made in Photoshop for this label to control the density, and then I've got that plugged into a color invert because the opacity map works opposite to the density. That isolates that color just to that part. So then for the actual color, I've got the logo, which I made, which again, just drag that into the diffuse. So that does the color there. And then if we take a look at the density here, I've got a color composite. So if you right click, go into utilities, go color composite, this allows you to combine two textures. So if I go into that, you can see we've got a triplanar as usual with the last material I just showed you. But what I can do is drag this label into the background. So I'll just zoom in a bit so you can see that. And I've got my blend mode here set to multiply. If it was normal, then nothing would come through. But multiply, if you use Photoshop and things like that, that will carry through all the black values. So what that does is combines the two textures like this. And when I plug that into density, as we now know from earlier, black results in 0. So whenever we execute that geometry, there will be no fuzz on the label there, which gives us this nice kind of label look. So that is pretty much it. The only thing I think that other people wanted me to touch on was how this sky was done here, which is very simple. You may have already worked it out from when I showed you around the scene. It's basically just a metal material with a very light gray color, and I've got no roughness on it. I think I've got a bit of a bump map on there just to give a little bit of imperfection in the same way that I did with the floor. And then all this is doing is reflecting another disc, which is here in the sky, with a flat texture on there. And that's just got a stock image in there. And I've adjusted the color by using utility, color adjust. And all I've done is increase the contrast and the saturation just to get a look I was happy with. And this has caught the camera in the right setup there. It reflects perfectly in there. And you could skip this part if you were using a HDRI to control your sky here, but I didn't like how that affected the color of my entire scene, so that's why I chose to do it this way. And doing it this way also meant that there was no shadow being cast on the scene by the disc because of where it was placed in the scene and reflected by this mirror here. So that's pretty much it. So I suppose I can pass it back to you, Derek, now for any questions that people may have, and I'll see if I can answer them and help you out.
Absolutely. That was absolutely wonderful, Shane. Thank you so much. Can you hear me okay?
Yep, loud and clear.
Great. I'll have you leave your screen up because we had some questions. So one thing is, I just want to say I absolutely love the idea here, because one of the things people ask all the time is, how do I learn KeyShot? What's the best way to learn KeyShot? And the idea of kind of creating sort of your own mini client is a really brilliant idea to kind of help uncover that. For things like, how you used the texture mapping with the light, where did you learn some of these secrets that you've shown here today?
So as I mentioned earlier, I think that one was from a very old tutorial on YouTube I think it was by Sam Does Design, who I'm sure most of you already know, where he created his own texture and plugged it into the spotlight in this way. So it's a really powerful technique that you can use in so many different ways. You're not even limited to just image textures. You could repeat the same thing using a video map as well, and get some really cool leaves blowing in the wind if that's your kind of style. So it's one of my favorite things to try and add to things at the moment, I think.
Great. One of the questions folks had is sort of, photorealism versus kind of making things more kind of realer than real, or sometimes making things sort of seem, a bit surreal, right? As opposed to just straight photorealistic. When you're doing these exercises, do you focus on making a photoreal image, or do you kind of play around with different ideas?
It depends on on the product and the client. So for me, I will usually find out pretty quickly in the process whether someone is after realism or whether they're after something more stylized. So you would, that lends itself to the product as well. So for this exercise here, when I was defining my target audience, I knew I wanted it to be quite light, quite playful, and to match some of that the inspiration in my mood board. And a lot of that stuff was they're almost photography setups rather than this is a slipper which is on someone's bedroom floor because they want that young, vibrant, exciting branding. So I think with that sort of thing, it's just about, you can definitely try both avenues, but I think the product and the purpose of the image decides that for you pretty quickly.
Okay. One question is, do you have any sort of tips and tricks that you use to kind of really get a professional sheen on your renders? I think at one point you were sort of showing, how to cut, in the case of the fuzz, right? You want to kind of do some things to make it look, not too perfect, right? In order to make it look real.
Yeah.
What are some kind of other tricks that you find are kind of quick ways to make your renders look really professional?
I think if realism is what you're going for, then it's all in imperfections, and you can take these as far as you want to go depending on what it is you're trying to do. So if I just use this sphere here as an example, and if we just jump into there, and if we just bring this roughness down to 0, you can go for something. Let's actually make it black as well, so we can really see this. So this would look obviously way too perfect to be a something that's real, because nothing is going to be that smooth and either that perfectly round. So what you would want to do is introduce a bit of variance. So one quick tip for this is to go into your textures and into something like the granite texture. If you double click that, press C to view it, and set the color to white, then adjust that scale a little bit for you, and plug this into something like the roughness, then you can see here that's quite extreme, but we're just starting to introduce some variance in the roughness. So if you click this connection, go into utilities, and go to your color to number, you can use this to map the values, where white would be completely rough, black is completely smooth. So if we just wanted something fairly subtle, we could do like a 0.05 and something like 0.1. You can see the difference in the values here, and you might be able to see, maybe if I bump this up a bit more, you can start to see it in this reflection here. If I get nice and close, that there's a variance going on, which if you look at anything in real life, it's weird. Once you see, once you're told these things, you start looking at things around your house like you're a bit strange, because you're analyzing the reflections of a bit of plastic that's in your kitchen or something. But yeah, I think that would be my main kind of tip for realism, is try to introduce imperfections using roughness and bump maps.
That's great. Thank you. And then at one point you sort of showed using the region render to kind of, people use a lot to kind of figure out what the sample count should be when they're doing their final renders. Can you just talk briefly about kind of how you use region render in your workflow?
Yeah. So I like to use the region render. I also like to use kind of the heads up display. If you press H on your keyboard, then you get all this information here, which tells you, about what sample count you're looking at, because a lot of the times people say, oh, well, this looks nice in my real-time render, but then I don't know how to get it to look that nice. Well, if you wait enough time, you will see, okay, well, this is on 95 samples and I'm really happy with how that looks. And then if you jump into your region render, as you can see, that will get to the sample count much quicker. My frames per second has almost doubled. So that's how I would use it, is I would isolate certain parts that I'm working on, especially when you're working with something like fuzz. I think I was fortunate that hopefully didn't lag too much, but something like fuzz and velvet can be quite heavy on your PC. So your region render is going to be a godsend, especially if you're getting into those nitty gritty details, like on the microscopic level.
That's wonderful. Yeah, I mean, I guess a lot of people ask about that in terms of the sample counts. That's very helpful. I'll ask you one last question as we're getting near the top of the hour here. Someone's asking about some of the renderings you had shown earlier, your previous work, and kind of
Hmm.
using smoke in the effect to kind of get a real dramatic look. How do
Yeah.
you get that smoke into KeyShot, or is it a post process? How do you work with that?
I usually add it in KeyShot. So if I just quickly see if I can add this in. So you would add it in a container, so something like a cube. Um, let's see if my computer is going to agree with me. So you do need it to be quite big, if depending on what you're going to fill it with. So then you would double click on it and you would change the material to a scattering medium. And this is basically going to work as fog or smoke. So using your transparency distance and your density, you can control just how thick that is. So if we bring that down, wow, way too high. Yeah, you can start to see that we're seeing through this. And it actually works really well with the spotlight material, but just be careful because it can be quite heavy on your computer. Um, and then to get that smoke pattern, you would use something that's called, I think it's a VDB texture. And I haven't actually got them on me now, but Liam Martin, who's another great, KeyShot user, he did a collaboration with Render Weekly and created some VDBs which were free to download. I'm not sure if they're still available because I think this was over 2 years ago now. But that's how I would get those patterns. There is you can download them from a bunch of sources. You can even make them yourself in programs like Blender, and you get some really nice effects. Like you can kind of see the almost like a bit of God rays coming in here when you're using scattering mediums.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much. I'm going to take this screen share for a second just so I can show
Mm-hmm.
folks the next couple of sessions. But a big thank you to Shane for sharing with us today. Really fantastic. A couple of folks had some more specific questions that kind of were talking about different CAD programs. So we'll follow up with some of those folks directly, individually over email. It looks as though right now I can't share my screen, Josh, if you can give me the host. But yes, we'll have another session today at noon, as I mentioned. Brooke Harrington will be going through KeyShot Sketch to Shelf, and then Mike James will be on at 2 p.m. today. So 2 great sessions. People were asking about YouTube. Yes, this is both streaming on YouTube. If you go to keyshot.com, you can see the live stream from there, or go to our YouTube channel and get that. And everything will also be recorded for later. So you can see on here 3 sessions today. We'll have 3 more sessions tomorrow, and then ending with 3 sessions on Thursday. So definitely join that. Also, people were asking about, in addition to sort of the content, we have great KeyShot 10 tutorials walking you through the new features in KeyShot 10, as well as the KeyShot Essentials series, which walks people through KeyShot all the way from getting started to the configure and viewer. So in addition to the great content you're going to see this week, there's all this wonderful content out there as well under KeyShot. If you go to our main website and go to resources learning. So thank you again, everyone, for joining us right now. And we will see you all again at noon. And thank you to Shane.